Hi, I'm Dr. Mitch Harlan, and welcome to the Truth Talks podcast. Today, I'm joined by an amazing guest, but before I introduce them to you, I want to ask that you please like and subscribe below. That way, we can continue to bring you these incredible stories. And if you're already liked and subscribed to our channel, we thank you for all of your support. Hi, I'm Dr. Mitch Harlan, and welcome to the Truth Talks podcast. Today's episode, we are having Stephen Rowe come to the show. How are you, Stephen?
I'm good, Mitch.
Stephen, this story that you're getting ready to share with us today is probably one of the hardest that any parent obviously could ever go through. And having said that, during a lot of podcasts, there's a lot of back and forth, and I'm going to make an exception today, and the exception is I'm going to have you start from start to finish with your story without any interruption so that the entire story gets told.
Sure, Mitch. I'm really humbled to be here. I'm just a everyday father of a 6-year-old son, and unfortunately, I lived out every parent's worst nightmare. There's nothing special about me. I'm not a professional athlete or any of the amazing entrepreneurs you've had on your show in the past. I'm just a guy that loved my son and loved God. So what I really want to tell, though, isn't a story of tragedy. It's more of a love story. I really feel that in order to understand how I overcome and how I can continue to live through this and walk this path that nobody ever wants to walk, you have to understand how much I love my son. So I kind of want to just tell a lot of story about him. I will kind of talk about what happened, but I really truly feel that without love and without faith, you can't overcome death. My son, he was 6 years old and 10 days when tragedy struck. And this was only about 9 months ago. But I want to share my story as fresh as it is, because I know we hear a lot from people that have recovered from a lot of things, and that's great. All the encouragement and power to those people that have done that. But when we're really going through the fire and walking through it, understanding how somebody else has dealt with that and has gone through it, I think is a unique aspect. And I will say that, I may be surviving and enduring, but every day is still painful. It's a pain that doesn't go away. But I was told within 2 or 3 days of what happened to treasure hunt. And I think that's been a really important aspect of my recovery, because when we're at the worst of the worst in our lives, there are a lot of people, they're still very good people. And they step up and they bless you. And, if you look, even God blesses you, even through the worst of it. And if you choose to see those things, as I reflect back on that week, month, even 9 months since, what I see is the best in people. And I see, the best of God throughout all of this. So the big kind of underlying moral to that is what you plant in your mind is going to be what will grow eventually. And that's what I see now when I look back. But I want to give you a little bit of a background on, my history, just to kind of help you understand where we were. I was married in 2011. With every relationship, there was good and there was bad. One of our biggest issues that we had early on was fertility problems. And while we were fortunate enough to be blessed with a single child, children don't always fix those deep foundational issues, as everyone knows. And while the point of this isn't really to harp on the marriage or the eventual divorce, I feel that it's important just so people understand one of the big aspects that I dealt with through this. I remember one night when I was putting my son to bed. He was probably 3 or 4 years old at the time. And my wife hadn't come home that night, and he really wanted mommy. And he didn't want daddy to put him to bed. He wanted mommy. It's the kid's security, they all always seem to want mom. And as I was putting him to bed, he was just crying, I want mommy, I want mommy, I want mommy. And I couldn't do anything. And I remember my heart just breaking, and I just sat there by his bed trying to comfort him, but just crying myself because I couldn't help. And in that moment, I remember thinking, I have to make this work. I have to stick this out. I have to make sure this marriage doesn't fall apart because this kid needs his mom. I have to stick it out for the kid. But eventually the marriage did fall apart. And when he actually died while in her care, I was left with so much guilt, thinking that if I just would have stuck it out, if I just would have figured out a way to make it work, then he might still be here today. And that was a really challenging thing for me to have to confront and deal with. I think I'm still probably dealing with that to this day. I probably will honestly burden that for a long time. That's going to be something I'll have to work out with God and, with all the other different things that go through that. But at any rate, I just don't want people to think that it's an easy thing to deal with. Iain was my only child. And at the time he passed, I was divorced and splitting custody 50-50. And I just loved being a dad, as everybody does. I mean, if you have kids, I mean, they're great. There are moments where they kind of push you. In particular, I can think of one moment just a few months before he passed, and COVID had just kind of started at that point in time. And Iain comes into my room. It's probably 4:30 in the morning, the perfect time for a kid to come in and wake you up. And he's like, Daddy, come quick. I was like, what is it? He's like, I accidentally forgot how much toilet paper to use. And I'm like, great. Everything that I want to deal with at 4:30 in the morning is a clogged toilet. On top of that, being COVID, there was no toilet paper anywhere. The kids just flushing gold down the toilet. So, yeah, kids will push your buttons at times, but I really loved seeing life through his eyes. I remember one of the days that I was out at the dog park with him, and the entire dog park was covered in wood chips. So it kind of caused a lot of bees to make their way out there to make their nest with some of the wood. And a bee had actually landed on the bench right next to us. And seeing that, I go into uber dad protect mode and, get my superhero cape on, and I take my shoe and I smash the bee and kill it. And I'm so proud of myself for protecting my son. And he looks at me, he's like, Daddy, did you just kill that bee? I said, yeah, pat myself on the back, I'm a good dad. And he's like, why would you do that? That was one of God's beautiful creations. And I was like, oh, kid, like just the way he saw life was just so pure. And it's something that I still try and get myself to do on a day-to-day basis. Anyways, on June 6th, 2020, he was at my house that morning, and it was around 1:30 in the afternoon, and he was playing on his tablet, as he loved doing. And I see my ex-wife's car pull up. I was on the third floor of my apartment complex. I look down and I see that there, and she just stopped. And I tell him, I was like, Iain, it's time to go. He's like, can I play my game for just a little bit longer? I was like, no, bud, you got to go. He's like, oh, come on, just a little bit longer. And I was like, no, your mom's here. She's waiting on you. He says, fine. I say, get your shoes on, bud. He says, fine. And then maybe through the grace of God, I guess I'd heard enough horror stories in my life about people that have lost a loved one. And the last thing that they remember having a conversation with was an argument or something bad. So I was always deliberate with my son that anytime he left my care, I would always say, I love you. So as he gets his shoes on and he starts walking out the door, and I holler out to him, I was like, I love you, bud. He says, I love you too. That was the last I ever heard from him. I got the call around 7:15 that night from a blocked number, which I don't usually answer. Probably a lot of us don't. But for some reason, I did answer it that night. And on the other line was somebody that introduced themselves as a police officer. And he said something. Really, honestly, don't remember a whole lot other than, Iain and beach and missing. There was a lot of white noise after I heard that. Just, you can't process what that really even means. So I pretty much dropped the phone and start into a panic. Like, what do? Do I just stay here by my phone? Do I leave for the beach? What if somebody's like, I'm kind of rambling because that's exactly how I felt in the moment. Your mind just becomes scattered. Well, I hopped in my truck and I headed towards the beach. And long story short, I actually went to the wrong beach for the first 2 hours until the news broke on TV.
Well, our coverage of the two West Michigan children who drowned over the weekend at Holland State Park continues tonight as family and friends of the victims come together and remember their lives.
And we got phone calls saying that it was at Holland State Park. So I headed out there, and when I got there, it was getting pretty late at that point in time. It was dark. All I could see were white caps. And for those that don't really understand, the Great Lakes, especially Lake Michigan, are very deadly lakes. I'll give you a few statistics here, and this is according to the Great Lakes Search and Rescue Project. From 2010 to 2019, an average of 84 people died per year in the Great Lakes, and 38 of those per year in Lake Michigan alone. In 2020, 109 people died in the Great Lakes, and 56 of them in Lake Michigan, including my son. Also, according to the Great Lakes Search and Rescue Project, Lake Michigan is particularly deadly for having waves as high as 6 feet, just like the ocean. But unlike the ocean, the waves don't spread out. They hit you, pummel you, run right after another. We experienced this. You hit right in the leg, you get kind of knocked down, and before you even can stand up, there's another one hitting you. It's incredibly compact. In fact, the day that Iain went missing and drowned, another little boy, I believe he was 15 years old, had already gone missing in the water that day. So it was 2 people at that particular location on that day. There was a red flag day, and that meant no swimming at all. So when I saw this, I became angry, to say the least. It was sickening. I don't really think I processed it, but looking at the waves, they were just violent, demonic almost to me. I eventually found one of the rangers there and tried to get some information from him. The news media was saying at the time that there was an Amber Alert issued for Iain. So I went to him and I asked him, what's going on? Was he in the water? There's an Amber Alert. They're saying that he's just missing. The news is actually saying that there's no reason to believe that he had actually drowned. What's going on? And he told me that with the first little boy that had gone missing that day, they were treating him as a rescue mission because he had been witnessed going under the water. With my son, no one saw him going under the water. And I asked him how that could be. Come to find out, on this particularly deadly day, at 6 years old, he was left in the water without a life jacket, with no flotation device whatsoever. And his mom went and apparently had left for the bathroom for a good 15 minutes, according to court records. During that time, when she came back, he had just gone missing. So there was the potential that someone had taken him. And at that time, I was confronted with 2 options in my life. One, that my 6-year-old son had drowned, and 2, that he had been taken potentially by a sexual predator. And there's not really a way to say which one was worse. Obviously, you'd want the hope that he could come back to you, but through what sort of hell? I mean, it was just a horrible confrontation to be confronted with. At any rate, it was late in the day, it was dark, and he said that they were no longer able to even have a search and rescue mission. The boats that were out on the water were capsizing, and the divers were getting knocked off, and it was unsafe to even try and look. That's how violent it was. So they were wrapping up, and they decided to come back the following morning around 7 o'clock. He said that I was welcome to stay there and to search the grounds. They had hoped that he may have left the water and tried looking for someone and had gotten scared and went hiding, but I knew that there wasn't a chance that had happened. I knew my little boy. At that time, they said, look, if you want, otherwise go home. We have to legally have enough time for these people to sleep and rest, to be able to safely do a search in the morning. So we can't do anything again until 7. I didn't know what to think. I hadn't processed anything. I didn't believe he was dead. I didn't believe he was even taken. I wanted to believe that he was down at the ice cream store sitting there and was waiting for somebody to find him. maybe he had found somebody and he was at my apartment. The thoughts just don't make sense at the time. At any rate, I decided to go back to my place and try and sleep, which was a completely foregone conclusion. That was not going to happen that night, because every time I closed my eyes, I was confronted with a vision of Iain being in the water and these waves that I saw hitting him, being knocked down, taken under the water, trying to stand up, reaching for anyone that could help him, and not being able to get up and being alone and scared, eventually not being able to breathe, the water overcoming his lungs and dying. That's what I saw every single time I closed my eyes that night. And it just made me sick, just sick. There wasn't any emotion other than just straight nausea whenever I'd close my eyes. So I just sat there, I laid there. I was engaged at the time to a new beautiful woman, and she had found out. I, of course, called her and told her what had happened. And she was out of town, so she decided to get on a plane that following morning, and she was driving to the airport that night. So we stayed on the phone a lot together that night, and that kind of helped me through those moments, pass the time. Around 5:30, my phone started ringing again, and it was my church small group, and they were saying they were getting ready to head out to the beach again and start looking. So I begrudgingly got up, and this is something that's difficult to describe and to even admit, but I never wanted to go to that beach that night. I didn't want to go to the beach the following morning. It made it too real. I wanted to live in disbelief, in ignorance that this was happening. I didn't want to confront it. It was too hard. But of course, with support and people that care, they say, you've got to be there. You're his father. You need to be there. And I knew I needed to. I just didn't want to believe that there was a need for me to be there. But I called my dad because I was in no position to drive, and he came and picked me up, and we drove out to the beach. We got there around 6 a.m. It was cold. And around that time, more people started showing up. The school principal, Iain was in kindergarten at the time. And my experience with the school principal was pretty much disciplinary at that point, or, your kid didn't come to school with a lunch, or just kind of the weird things. I didn't really know him on a personal basis, but he knew Iain, and he showed up. He didn't even see me, and he just made a beeline for the beach, the shoreline, as if he was about to jump in the water and try searching himself. I saw the teachers show up, the Sunday school teachers, the pastors, and the amount that everyone loved him just meant so much to me. It was reassuring to see all these people that would talk about how Iain loved God and loved people. It allowed me to know that he was in heaven. Anyways, the day continued to kind of wear on, and it started to warm up, and more people showed up. And finally, our church's head pastor at Central Wesleyan in Holland, his name was Pastor Craig. He spent a lot of time preaching at this church. It's a big church. He had a very, very colorful background throughout the world, preaching in different places. And I found out later that he had come to the park that day and said to the person that let him know what was going on that he had no idea what to say to me. And I find that particularly surprising, as much experience as he had, that he had no idea what to say to me. And I also find that particularly surprising because when he came and talked to me, he said the exact words I needed to hear, which obviously that came straight from the Holy Spirit. And he came up to me and he said, "Steve, I don't know what to say." He's like, "You're about to feel all the feelings that you could possibly feel right now. And to feel them all," he said, "don't repress them, because eventually they'll fester and they'll destroy you from the inside out. It's like you need to confront them. You need to allow yourself to process everything that you're about to feel. Anger, he's like, I'm angry. How could this happen? It's okay to be angry, but process it. Depression, you're going to feel the loss. process it. Like this moment right now, how you deal with it will define your life for the rest of your life. He looks over, and by this point, my fiance had shown up, and he says, "You've got a beautiful fiance right there. And there's a promise that there could be a new future for your life, a new family, new children." He's like, "But if you allow this to take a foothold and become what defines you, you could stand to lose all of that. Like this is the important moment in your life." And I say that that's exactly what I needed, because in that moment, I still hadn't confronted the fact that my son was gone. I hadn't seen a body yet. There were still boats on the water. Maybe somebody was about to find him. Maybe the Amber Alert would come through and somebody had taken him and they were going to recover him. I didn't know what to feel. I didn't know if I should be angry. I didn't know what to do. So he basically came to me and he said, "Your son just died. And now you've got to figure out how to live." And that was really impactful for me. It was exactly what I needed. Not everybody needs to hear that, but that's what I needed. And that's why I also know that that came from the Holy Spirit. And the day continued on, the longest by far day of my life, just sitting there watching boats circle. I learned more about search and rescue missions than I cared to ever learn. There's apparently an extreme science to rescuing and recovering bodies, which is really sad, honestly, that there's that many people that are lost. But they told us specifically with just the way that the tide was rolling in and the way that the waves were, that they expected that both of the bodies that they were looking for that day wouldn't be much more than 100 feet offshore, and that they would probably start heading towards the pier at some point. However, the water kind of comes back out, things tend to cycle by the pier, and the rocks of the pier tend to grab large objects. So that's where they were kind of focusing a lot of their search at. Unfortunately, due to the storm that had gone through that night, the water was so churned up that visibility was so poor that they could barely see their hand in front of their face. And it was very difficult. They had Dopplers that they would drop into the water. If they saw something that came back kind of large, and they'd send a diver in, and we'd see a couple divers go over. And when I'd see a diver go over, everything just kind of stopped. You watched, you didn't want to see them come up with a body, but you also kind of wanted them to come up with a body, because then you'd have some closure. And that was a sickening thing to deal with as well. So we distracted ourselves and we continued to tell stories. Another one of my favorites about Iain was, while I love him and I want to tell this love story that I'm telling you today about how great of a kid he was. I mean, he was 6. Kids have problems, and he wasn't perfect. There were bad days at school that we were trying to process through, and I'd kind of worked out a scenario with him to where if he was having a good day at school, then he'd get a treat after school. And most days I'd keep those treats as Skittles or M&Ms in my truck, and he'd come in and he's like, "Dad, I had a good day." And it was getting more and more frequent, which was great. Well, this one particular day he comes, I pick him up and he says, "Dad, I had a good day." And the teachers confirmed that, and it's like, "That's good, bud. I'm out of treats." So of course, that was, oh. So we had to go to the local gas station and go and pick something up. And that day he decided that he wanted to get a sleeve of 3 chocolate donuts. And I said, "All right, bud, you can have 1 chocolate donut, and I'm going to put the other 2 in front of the truck, and I'll keep those. You can have another one the following day if you have a good day," and so on and so forth. And he said, "No, Dad, I want to hold them. I want to hold them." I was like, "Bud, no, you're going to be tempted to eat these donuts." And he says, "Well, what's tempted?" And I tell him, temptation is when Satan tries to get you something to do something that you know you shouldn't. And he's like, Dad, no, I won't listen to Satan. I'll only listen to God. I promise. I'll only listen to God. He was really emphatic about this. So I was like, okay, we'll see how this goes. Maybe this becomes a life lesson for us. And I was like, "All right, bud, you can hold the other 2 donuts, but don't eat them." He's like, "I promise, I won't listen to Satan." All right, well, we get about a mile down the road, and this little voice comes from the back of my truck again, and he says, "Dad?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Satan's trying to get me to eat the other donut." I loved how he saw the world. And I love that he could see it that way. Well, the day kind of started wrapping to an end. And they told us that, again, they put through about 12 hours of search that day. And come 8 o'clock, they were going to have to legally close the search and go back in. So around 7 o'clock, you start seeing the boats move a lot more rapidly. And it felt like, the 2-minute drill at the end of the football game where they're trying to throw the Hail Mary and just, get that final score. It was just a real big play is what it felt like they were going for. And as they're going back and forth more rapidly, about 7:30, all the boats turn and they go in. I was like, well, it looks like they've kind of called it in for the day. And there were a lot of people there, a lot of support. But at this point, I was running on 36 to 48 hours without sleep. Didn't know if I'd get any more that night or not, but I was exhausted. So we went to the church and told them that we were going to be going in, headed home, trying to get some rest. And they said, take care. And we left, got in the truck, started heading down the road. We got about a mile down the road. And the small group leader from my church small group, she called me and said, hey, Steve, did you leave? And I said, yeah. She said, come back. We want to do a prayer over the water just to set the day on a proper note. And I was too exhausted to argue at that point. And I said, all right, we'll turn around, we'll come back. And when we get back to the state park, I got out of the truck, started heading towards the water, and an officer approached me, which wasn't uncommon for the day because, there was a criminal investigation going on. They had lost this child under the water, and, the detectives were there trying to figure out if there was foul play. So this was not the first time I'd actually had to talk with the police by that point. And I just figured it was another thing along that line. So this officer comes up to me and says, are you the father? And I said, yeah. And I almost kind of like tried to push him to the side, like, get out of my way. I've got something to do. And he's directly got right in my path. And he said, I'm sorry to say, but we recovered the body. I think at that point, I went right down on my knees hard. There's moments in your life where you recall certain things. I remember the moment he was born. I had asked a lot of my friends who were nurses whether or not to watch the birth of a child, because as a man, there's certain things you can't unsee. But they told me, just stand above and just watch the head. It's a miracle of life. It's not anything that you're going to scar you. So that's what I did. And I remember when he was born and seeing the doctor rotate his head from the back to the front and seeing the face. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's a human being. Like, there's a life here. It's a moment I'll never forget. I remember the sight, the sound, the look, all of it. When I was told that he died, I can only remember one thing, and that's pain. I don't remember who was there. There were a lot of people that were there. I don't remember what was said. I know my pastor was there. He came from somewhere and he started talking to me. I know what he said when he first came and talked to me, word for word. I can't tell you a word that he said when they told me that he was gone. I just remember pain. I hearken it to the passage in Matthew where they say that when Jesus died, that the earth shook and the cloth of the temple was torn. That's what it felt like. It felt like my earth was shattered. And I don't know how long I was down for, but when I kind of put my head up or stood up, I'm not sure, it was pulled right back into reality. And the officer said, so, which funeral home do you want to send the body to? Like, I know. At any rate, that was it. That was what happened. And I was left alone. My fiance was with me and we headed back to my apartment. But as I walked in, his toys were scattered around the apartment. His backpack sitting by the door. His rooms, they're scattered with clothes. There's no him ever again. So we were just sitting there in pain. I didn't know what to do. So I did what the pastor said, and I began to feel all the feelings. I began to process the worst of it. And I asked myself, what if the worst of the worst could have possibly happened here? What if he was, and this is not true, but what if he was actually left in the water alone to die deliberately? I had to process that, because as a father, I mean, our natural tendency is to, become Frank Castle and put on our Punisher and go make everybody else suffer for what happened to our child. We want to get even. We want to get revenge. If somebody caused us pain and suffering, we want them to feel pain and suffering. It's just a natural tendency. So I asked myself, what if the worst of the worst were true? What would I do? And I remember thinking that if I did those things, the only thing that would be ensured was that I'd never see him again, because it would send me down a dark path. And eventually I'd find myself damned to hell as well. So I knew that the only thing I could do to ever see him again was to honor his memory, to live a life by faith. I can't bring him back. I can make others hurt, but I'd only do myself harm. And I wanted to see him again. Every day I think about that. Every day I think about how much I miss him. And I know that the only way I'll ever see him again is to live a life that pleases God. And that's hard. That's a hard, deliberate choice to make. But that one thing kept me from spiraling into depression. It didn't take away the loneliness. The bedtime routines were gone. The reason to get up in the morning was gone. A lot of it just seemed pointless. So again, I was forced to start thinking about the good things and what sort of things I could remember about him. I think the hardest thing, though, was that it was nothing but memories. I couldn't make new memories, and that was extremely difficult. But I did have good ones, and ones that taught me life lessons. So I tried to overwrite things like being at the beach and being near water with good memories of the water. And one of those good memories I had was taking him down to the local beach here at Grand Haven. And we went down there one day to just get some hot dogs and play on the playground equipment and do a little bit of swimming. And I got out to the water, and it was shoulder to shoulder people. Just, they were having some sort of soccer on the water that day. And they just, all these soccer fields all over the beach. And we found a small little inlet where we could actually get to the water, and I could stand there, about 10 feet away from them, right on the shoreline, and watch them play. And another little boy showed up, and he was a little bit older, and I think he had a little Scooby-Doo life jacket on, and he was about the same size as Iain, though, because Iain was a big kid. He was 6 years old, 65 pounds, and 48 inches tall. And if you have any young ones, that's a big kid for that age. So anyways, this other kid shows up, and I could tell that he had some apparent mental handicaps. And I suddenly became concerned about these two playing together. And that's a thing I have to admit to. I'm not without my faults, but my concern was that he would splash this boy and that he may make him have a bad day. I don't know what the triggers are. And I didn't want this boy to have a bad time. My kid's a little bit rough. He can play hard sometimes. But I kind of sat there and just kind of, let's hope for the best. Iain's a good kid. He loves everybody. So, hopefully these two just have fun. And I just kind of sat back and watched them play. As I'm watching them play, kind of time goes by, and I'm watching what I can tell then at this point is the father and the mother and the grandfather and the grandmother are starting to make circles and rounds, and they're each taking turns watching them play. And we talk a little bit, and just, what's your kid's name? What's your kid's name? Just the kind of cordial stuff. Well, about a half an hour goes by, and then the parents kind of show up, and they're like, we're really late, but I can't take him away from this. Like, he never gets to play like this. And here I am confronted with a scenario where I had this reservation of allowing my child to play with somebody that was a little bit different from them, just because I didn't know how to handle it. And I felt just pathetic, honestly, that I would have had this reservation. My son, he doesn't see the differences. He just sees somebody to play with, to have fun with, and just, love everybody. And it taught me to not look at somebody to see what's different about each other, but to see how we can all love each other to their own capacity and what they need. And it was a special memory that I like to think about when I go to the water and the water hurts. That's a good memory there. He would teach me so much about how to live life, and just to see things through the innocence of a child. Well, as much as those memories helped, I mean, they only go so far. So I started reading a lot, watching faith-based movies, faith-based books. The Shack was one that helped out a lot. Heaven is for Real was a book that I resonated with a lot. In that book, there's a little boy named Colton, and he has appendicitis, I believe, and ends up having to go into surgery. And through this, he sees heaven and he's exposed to this. And while he's there, his father was in a room praying and needing help. And one of the conversations that Colton has with his dad after coming back to earth was that he could see his dad, and that Jesus and him went and they prayed for strength for his dad. And that just hit me so much, because I began to question, could my son possibly see me now? And if he could, would he be proud of how I'm living my life? And would he be proud of my actions? It's easy to sink into depression, and it's easy to turn to a bottle and just forget and, want to blame God for what could have happened. But what if my son's watching me? That puts a whole different perspective on things, because, I can't imagine how I would feel if my son was disappointed in me. So that was impactful to, again, helping me learn how to process and overcome some of these horrible negative thoughts. On top of that, my therapist told me a story at one point in time of a coworker that she knew whose father had died. And this man, in grief of the father, he seemed to be doing fine, but had a lot of depression and didn't know where to turn and didn't know who to talk to. And that depression eventually overtook him and he committed suicide. And she said, if there was somebody out there that didn't know who to talk to and felt isolated and alone, and that nobody could understand my pain, imagine if they knew of you and knew of somebody that they could talk to and did understand. She's like, your story could save lives. So that's what really kind of motivated me to start sharing. And I did. I began sharing on Facebook and blogging and various forums, and all those different things have now brought me even to Dr. Mitch and Truth Talks and various forums where I can share this. And it's honestly, it's very cathartic to me to be able to do this. Being able to keep my son's story and message and spirit here, it's like it brings me a little bit closer to him. So it's really nice. And then it reminds me of all these different things now that we're 9 months past, and the treasure hunting and what I see. And as I look back and reflect, a very odd aspect of this was, as I mentioned, I had a fiance. Well, we were getting ready to get married and I was going to be moving out of my apartment. I had a dog. Well, she had 2 dogs that she was bringing. We were going to live in an apartment with 3 dogs. So we had just purchased a house. And within 1 week of Iain's passing, we had to move out of the apartment, which was challenging. Of course, that meant I had to pack up his room, and you can imagine the amount of pain that was dealt with there. But at any rate, during this move, we had hired some movers, 2 men in a truck. Somehow they got word of what had happened. And the day after it happened, I got a phone call and they said, hey, these movers, they want to move you for free. And they'll move whatever it is that you have. They'll take as much time as you need, take as many trips as possible, but they want to offer their services for free. It's a treasure. We had my small group realize that we were going to this house and needed a fence in the backyard so that there would be a space for the dogs, and knew that it would mean that I'd have to start getting quotes and deal with contractors, and knew that I was in no place to deal with that. Well, lo and behold, one of the people in our small group had a construction business Guess who showed up to build a fence for me? And all of that, it left me kind of feeling a lot like Job, and going through the worst, losing, my marriage, my house, my son. I feel like I lost it all. But in all of that, I, as with Job, did not curse God, and God eventually blessed him. Well, that left me with one last thing that I felt that I had to do. And as I've kind of hearkened to, there was a criminal investigation that went and took place, and my ex-wife was eventually convicted of felony child neglect. And during her court sentencing, they offered me the option to come in and say something to her. So at that point, as a father, especially, you're then confronted with, do you give in to the anger and tell her just where she can go and be stuck for the rest of her life? Or, as I'm sitting here trying to tell the audience that it's important to forgive and to not let those things take root in your heart, do I go into this sentencing and forgive her? Or do I say anything and just be like, enough? Well, I eventually chose to go and speak. And that day I was trembling, to be honest. I don't think I'd ever been quite as frightened as I was just that day, having to be confronted with the reality of what had happened. And I got up in front of the court and I said that I don't know what happened that day, and I probably never will. But it's not for me to pass judgment. That will take place between her and God. For me, I'm an imperfect person that needs the forgiveness of God for the imperfections in my life. And if God's going to forgive me, I have to forgive others. That's just the way there is to it. So at this point, I may not want to be your best friend, but I release judgment and I forgive you so that I can move on. And that was it. So through that, I can say that, similar to Job, I'm now at this point remarried, and we're actually expecting a new baby boy next month. And God has blessed us. I chose not to give in to that dark path. I didn't lose the relationship. The promise of a new family has come true. And now, when I think of that vision of Iain succumbing to the waves and the water, it's a little bit different. I still see him falling, and I see him struggling, and I see him going under the water and not being able to get his feet back underneath him. And I see him reaching to try and break the plane of the water, and for somebody to help him, as alone as he is. And as he reaches up, another hand reaches down, and it pulls him out of the water and pulls him into heaven, because it's Jesus welcoming him. And he's no longer scared. He's in a good place. And there, he waits for me.
Well, it's obviously healthy because it's working. And as again, when we run these stories, it's always in hopes that somebody who's going through this or something similar gets to hear your words, process it however they take it, something good happens to them, something that you say changes for the better for them. So, Stephen, again, you come on to tell your impactful story. There's a lot of people out there that may want to get a hold of you, may want to be able to talk some things through with you. How do people get a hold of you, or how can they find communication with you?
Sure. I love sharing with people. I love hearing their stories. There's a unfortunate camaraderie through death, but it's one that I embrace, and it's one that I don't run away from. So I actually do have a website. It's www.livelikeIain.org, and that's Iain spelled IAIN, a little bit of a variant to it. So, but we have a website there that allows for emails to come through. There's a link to a memorial Facebook page that's set up in his honor. I run that as well. So, if you want to see a little bit more about a sweet little boy, you can find it there, and you can also reach out and contact us. It's a joint effort that we have a lot of people that kind of have eyes on it, just for a lot of security type reasons and that. But it's another one of those ways that we can find meaning through all of this. And I think there's one last thing I wanted to share with you real quick. was the blessing that in loss, we kind of try and find some way to honor that we lost. And in the last week, we actually decided to start sponsoring a child through Compassion International. The website allows you to search by birth date. So we actually found a little boy named Matthew, whose name actually has the same meaning as Iain's, and it just kind of jumped out to us like that, same birthday. And that's one of the things that we're hoping to eventually someday kind of partner with and bring more light to the issue of, yeah, we lost one, but we can save others. So trying to just do more good in this world and keep healing and bringing the light to it. So.
Well, again, thank you for that. I'm sure people are going to reach out to you. And I think that that's one of the ultimate ways of healing is to tell your story and hear other people's story, because there's always some way out. There's always a way out. And I think we do that, and we find that through story. So again, thank you so much for coming on our show. Appreciate everything that you've done as far as helping us get out the word, save a life, help a life, whatever we can do. But thank you again. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mitch.